Hello and welcome to today's webinar, the title of which is Stress and the Inner Dialogue. My name is Dr. Nigel Lester. I'm a psychiatrist and I'm Director of Mental Health at Palm Health. Stress, of course, is a topic that I talk about all the time because it's central to our understanding of well-being and ill-being, particularly when we're looking at it from a preventative but also a personalized approach. We often, however, focus on the external sources of stress, the stressors that we most commonly talk about, like the divorce and losing our job, moving house. And we forget that on a day-to-day basis, the perpetuation of stress is mainly a result of what is going on inside our mind on a day-to-day basis. And so what I want to do today is just try to give a little bit of an overview of this issue and this topic of the inner dialogue, even though this is obviously quite a profound and far-reaching subject. But I think we can make it accessible if we think of it in these three chapters: the nature of the inner dialogue, and just consider a little bit about what is our concept of it, and how it can become unhealthy. And then we can look at some practical ways in which we could maybe work to cultivate a more healthy inner dialogue. So I use the term inner dialogue because in most cases it is a conversation. Of course, it's a conversation with yourself, but it may be between different parts of yourself, or you may designate interlocutors, other people that you're talking to, from people who you've sort of internalized, whose voices you have internalized. One of the important things that I want to stress, though, is that the words we use are very intimately linked to the thoughts and emotions we feel. So this is one of the ways that the outside comes inside. And there it can sort of take on a life of its own. So that whatever the nature of the external stress, it is actually the continual chatter and noise that is going on inside our own mind that actually becomes the immediate and perpetuating source of stress. Of course, as we've said, we do tend to more readily focus on the outside and what is done to us, but this tends to leave us feeling like victims of the world, and we forget that we have the power to change how we respond to things. So to quote Shakespeare, "For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." The inner dialogue is considered to be part of our normal development. So we can reassure ourselves in one way straight away by saying that you are not crazy if you talk to yourself. It's not actually the case that everybody talks to themselves. Some people don't identify words or speech as part of their inner world. They describe more abstract ways of being aware of thoughts and feelings. But for many people, words and speech are clearly part of this. The Russian sociologist and psychologist Lev Vygotsky was one of the many influential writers in the field who described the inner dialogue and its role in development. He considered that in childhood there was what he called private speech was a very important way in which we learn. The private speech was the child's way of internalizing the external speech that they were exposed to, and it helped to guide their linguistic and cognitive development. This was somewhat at odds with the opinions of Jean Piaget, another great figure in child development, who thought that language depended on thought for its development, and therefore saw what he called egocentric talk, so this sort of childlike talk, was mainly a function in the formation of the self and the individuation of the child. Another view comes from Jacques Lacan, the French philosopher and psychoanalyst, who described what he called primordial monologues, where the child was not so much talking to themselves, but language itself was, if you like, talking to the unconscious, and in that way creating the unconscious. in the sort of mid 20th century, there was a veritable gold rush of child development studies around the issue of private speech or inner speech. If you were unlucky enough to be the child of a parent who was a cognitive scientist in the 1960s, you were probably recorded at some point. And what this plethora of research in this area really has shown us is that children's self-talk most likely is guiding thinking and actions and aids in the development of not just concrete language formation, but other cognitive functions. So from the very beginning, the words we use are internalized and form an important part of the coding of the brain and the way that we subsequently see the world. Of course, in the adult, these verbalizations are internalized and more often will become silent speech, although, of course, many adults, myself included, do continue to, talk to themselves when it's opportune. Of course, before the cognitive scientists of the later 20th century, the psychoanalysts had been extremely active documenting and analysing the inner worlds of their patients. In psychoanalysis, an emphasis obviously was placed on interpretation. Patients were encouraged to free associate, and free association being just the outpouring of thoughts, speech from their inner world, which the analyst would themselves absorb and would create in the analyst's impressions and interpretations that they would then send back, if you like, to the patient. Freud himself said that the ego wears a cap of hearing, and by that he was referring to the fact that he felt that verbal information had a primacy of importance in ego formation, a sense of self, that what is said to us, said about us, and what we say to ourselves, the words in particular have a very strong effect on our ego formation. Of course, later the cognitive sciences would find this kind of subjective interpretation approach of the psychoanalysts somewhat at odds with their desire to be seen as a hard, data-driven science. But it's important to remember that even when we make tape recordings, we are still obviously interpreting that information, and qualitative data is no less important than quantitative data. We know from fMRI observations of the brain that during inner speech, the speech decoding area is often active. By this, we're referring to Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe, usually in the left hemisphere, and it's the area where we decode speech. Wernicke's area, the area of expressive speech, is not active because we're not actually speaking out loud. And it does seem that this inner speech plays an important role in normal human function in self-regulating behavior. So we, for example, talk ourselves down or talk ourselves up. Problem solving, critical thinking, reasoning, and future thinking. So the internal world is more than just the basic life. It's not just left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. This internal world and this intimate connection between our words and our thoughts also mimics something that we see in the material world, and that is that there is an interconnectedness of all of these functions. So we've already said that inner speech and the words, when we think in words or we speak to ourselves, this is intimately connected to the thoughts and the emotions. The emotions, of course, connect us to the body, but the inner speech is also connected to the external speech. And so we can see that our behavior and the way in which we shape the community and the society within which we live, this is all part of a psychological ecosystem. And it's very important to be aware of what it is that we're bringing into this ecosystem. This is captured quite well by the quote from the 20th century philosopher J. Krishnamurti, who said it begins at school and you go through life repeating what others have said. You're therefore a second-hand human being. We just said, of course, that words in their intimate connection with thoughts and feelings can be very impactful on the body. This is through the activity primarily of the limbic system. The limbic system is that emotional old mammalian brain that we've referred to many times in other webinars where we've talked about the effect of emotions on the body. The limbic system can be thought of as a kind of highway between the body and words and emotions. It is connected through the hormone systems, neuronal systems, the autonomic nervous system, and other messenger molecules. This ancient brain creates emotional memories, and it changes structurally and affects the functions of our vegetative, our unconscious and automatic bodily functions, and creates significant effects on an ongoing basis. Just one more reason why we should pay attention to the words that we use and that we expose ourselves to. Another concept that many of you who've participated in these sessions before will be very aware of is the biopsychosocial model of personality from the work of my colleague and fellow Palm Health psychiatrist Robert Cloninger. This is a highly instructive and useful model of personality based on years of fundamental research in genetics, neurophysiology, and behavior. And we've talked at length on previous occasions about the temperament and the character as being, building blocks of the dynamic of our personality. But I also want to draw your attention to that very top part of this this model, which is our identity and our conscious awareness of our goals and values, as well as our experience of life through our emotional drives. We start to build a narrative. We start to build a story about who we are. And that is very much influenced by the way we talk about ourselves to ourselves. So we've said that the internal and external speech are obviously linked. It's important to pay attention to what we are listening to. In today's world, there is an almost 24-hour stream of words coming at us. There is an incessant chatter that we are exposed to. And many commentators have remarked on the strange paradox of living in a world where there is so much communication available, and yet we seem to be losing our ability to communicate effectively. We're exposed to television, phones, newspapers, and constant gossip and chatter, all of which is feeding into our inner dialogue. The question arises, though, that when we are having this dialogue, who are we talking to? This constant chatter is often part of our conversation with ourself. So it's a conversation with the ego, the self, what we may conceive as our conscience. It's a conversation with our desires that may seem to come from some deeper organic or physical part of us, but also a myriad of unwelcome and maybe welcome guests and parasites that we have allowed into our thoughts and into our inner world. Let's just take a minute to consider the ego in a little more depth, because the ego is very much part of what drives our inner dialogue. And we can think of the ego as that invisible structure that holds up our psychological self so that it can move through time and space. And a good parallel would be to think about the skeleton, which holds up our physical self. So the skeleton, like the ego, is a dynamic structure. The skeleton, as it is in your body when you're alive, is not quite like the calcified object hanging in the doctor's office. The living skeleton is constantly interconnecting with the rest of the body. It deposits and releases minerals. It makes blood cells. Blood permeates it. It changes its shape and form throughout life. But the skeleton, like the ego, gives our body something to form onto. With bones, we can attach muscles from point A to point B, and then the contraction of the muscles can allow us to move freely and independently. Without a skeleton, it's a little sad. We're just a pile of muscles and organs and soft tissues. Somebody else would have to scoop us up and put us in a bucket if we wanted to move from place to place. And so it is with the ego, that without the ego structure, we're not able to move through psychological space. We feel lost and uncertain about who we are. Each time we enter a new situation, we would be rediscovering and reinventing ourselves. So the ego is a necessary part of of our psychic architecture and how we interact in psychological space. But it needs to be kept in a balance that is a constant dynamic balance, a little bit like the action of a swinging pendulum. If our ego becomes too weak, we suffer with inadequacy and low self-esteem. The parallel with this in our skeleton is if we have a skeleton that is not strong enough, such as in hypomineralization disorders like osteoporosis, the skeleton can't hold up our own weight. On the other hand, if the pendulum swings the other way and the ego becomes too strong, we find ourselves being defensive and overly proud. And then we're vulnerable to stress. In the same way, the skeleton that develops a hypermineralization disorder, where it becomes too rigid, is vulnerable to fracture when stresses are placed on it, because it loses flexibility. So our ego has to move up and down in a space of self-acceptance where we are able to tolerate our weaknesses, but we are able to also promote our strengths. Again, this balancing act can be perhaps understood when we think about the natural world. The picture on the left shows the effect of an earthquake in Nepal, where many of the buildings are built of reinforced concrete. Reinforced concrete is strong but rigid. It doesn't have flexibility. So it's like the rigid ego. When it's agitated enough, it just crumbles. The picture on the right is that of a bridge famously collapsed. I think it was over the Puget Sound in Washington State. And this bridge was built too flexible, without enough structural strength, and when it began to resonate with the movement of traffic over it, it collapsed under its own movement, because there was not enough strength. It was too weak, too supple to carry the strength of the traffic over it. So there's this constant balancing act that needs to be performed. It's worth reflecting a little bit on what happens when we become defensive. There are many unconscious defense mechanisms that can influence the nature of our inner dialogue. Just as we protect ourselves physically in a completely reflexive way, so we protect ourselves psychologically in a reflexive way. If you feel that you are physically under attack, it's not possible to suppress the reflex. So, for example, if you're talking with someone and a fly flies at their face and they swipe it away with their hand and their hand almost touches your face, you will reflexively move out of the way. What you won't do is do a Jackie Chan and then sort of kick them in the head, get them on the ground and put them in an arm lock. Because you know that whilst you ducked to avoid being hit, the person wasn't intending to harm you. You're not in great danger. You don't have to defend yourself. The same thing happens with the ego. We reflexively react when we feel our ego, our sense of self, is under attack. And to suppress that is generally not a very satisfying thing to do. It's almost impossible to suppress that, and with that suppression comes a whole host of other problems. But what we can do is become aware of this defensive reflex and not turn it into, again, a Jackie Chan reaction, and see that our reflexive tendency to defend ourselves does not have to result in us going to, endless degrees to constantly ruminate on what happened, or to condemn or attack the other person. So these concepts lead us very nicely to think about how unhealthy the inner dialogue can be. It's very nicely captured by this quote from Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher, who said, "My life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened." The inner dialogue is full of worries and ruminations about what could be, what might be, how we think we have been wronged, or what might happen to us in the future. And most of it is sustained around things that will never come to pass. Perhaps one of the most studied parts of the inner dialogue is the inner critic. This is a particular form of the inner dialogue in which there is a sort of a familiar voice or set of voices that are constantly berating and condemning us. It's a sort of, if you like, sense of conscience run amok, where we're no longer just simply motivating ourselves to be better and to be the best that we can, but we're actually constantly berating ourselves to the point that we're getting in our own way. Typical manifestations of inner critic type activity are all or nothing thinking, where we can never exist in that middle place where most of life actually happens. Either everything has to be perfect, or we don't want anything to do with it at all. Either it has to be my way, or I don't want anything to do with it. Similarly, the inner critic can create a tendency to generalize, where we capitalize on that all too human trait of focusing always on deficits or what is missing in our life. And instead of noticing, for example, in a relationship that there have been 1,000 small acts of kindness, the minute there is one unfortunate act of unkindness, we focus on that and generalize in that as being what we are about, and how, what we're like and how terrible we are. In the same vein, the inner critic can make us fall into the trap of discounting the positives in life and only focusing on negatives. And another very common manifestation of the inner critic is this tendency in many people to become perfectionistic. So to berate themselves or berate others for anything other than a perfect behavior, a perfect solution. Voices and dialogues like the inner critic can take the form of yourself talking to yourself, or they can also take the form of us having private conversations with a cast of characters, a veritable Greek chorus of interlocutors that can exist in our head. Recent research into the inner dialogues of students have shown that there are some very common characters that seem to occur in a lot of people, examples of which are the faithful friend, the ambivalent parent, the proud rival, and the helpless child. And these describe the nature of the conversations that people are having. So the voice that they are talking to, for example, might be the proud rival. It might be someone who you feel that you're in competition with, and that you constantly have to justify yourself to, and that you're constantly trying to better in your head. One of the most unhealthy aspects of the inner noise is the way in which it pollutes our minds. And so just as the pristine natural landscape can be polluted by trash, so our minds can be polluted by mental trash, by incessant chatter, by incessant criticism that serves no purpose but to clutter up the landscape, preventing the natural growth and flow of our mind. It's also important to note that when there is a lot of internal noise and chatter, and we're trapped in our own world, that there's a lot of things that we will be missing. So internal noise can create a lack of focus and attention. It can interfere with our working memory, the ability to sort of keep things on a clipboard as we're working through a conversation or other activity. It can create tunnel vision and prejudicial views of the world. Our perceptions are distorted. Automatic thoughts can be reinforced and become more fossilized, more ingrained in our brain, and we can become more egocentric. Many people who come seeking help with a difficulty to remember or focus and pay attention are actually dealing with an incessant and compulsive internal dialogue that is getting in the way. We saw earlier where, how the effect of Broca's area being activated during inner speech. So it is almost literally as if you are trying to focus or do something with somebody talking incessantly in your ear. A good example of this is evident in this little commercial that I'm going to show. This is a car commercial from British television in the 1980s, and we're going to do we're all going to participate in a little neuroscientific experiment. So I'm not going to say any more, but let's just watch this together.
To test just how much attention the attention-stealing design of the new Skoda Fabia actually steals, we left one parked on this ordinary road in West London. We wanted to see if its sharp crystalline shapes, bold lines, and lower, wider profile would attract the desired level of attention. Will the 17-inch black alloy wheels stop passers-by in their tracks? Will the angular headlights attract the attention of other road users? Will a crowd gather to check out its fresh, sporty look? Well, not quite. But did the attention-stealing design distract you from noticing that the entire street has been changing right before your very eyes? Don't believe us? Have another look. Did you spot the van changing to a taxi? How about the scooter changing to a pair of bicycles? Or the lady holding a pig? Let alone the fact that the entire street is now completely different. Didn't think so. So there we have it. Proof that the new Skoda Fabia is truly attention-stealing.
So this shows us very clearly some of the ways in which the brain works. When your attention is directed towards the car, you're not as capable of seeing what is happening right in front of your eyes. In the same way, inner noise will direct your attention in one way and prevent you from seeing the obvious. And also may direct your attention to what you expect rather than what actually happens, because those inner schemas are so outdated and inaccurate and not related to reality. So it demonstrates how incredibly difficult it is to perceive clearly when mental noise pollution is in the way and when our attention is being directed one way rather than the other. But in addition, we can also see from this little experiment not just how important it is if we want to try to avoid this kind of misperception, how important it is to calm this inner noise. And there are other things that we can clearly observe here from this little neuroscience experiment, and that is that the changes taking place that we overlook so easily, they were all small and incremental. And the human brain indeed struggles to perceive these small incremental changes. And it's the same with, for example, our inner narrative. The story may have changed, it may have changed for the better, but as these are small incremental changes, we often do not notice them. You know, I often will spend time with a patient reflecting back on how things are different from 6 months ago, just so that we can clearly get it into our minds that things have changed, because most of the time people don't observe these small changes and they believe that nothing has changed and nothing ever will, where in fact a lot may have changed without them noticing. But likewise, the narrative can change for the worse, and we also don't realize that. So there can be a series of small incremental changes chipping away at our sense of healthy function, our basic humanity, our virtues. And in a time of heightened anxiety, we may be very distracted and not see that because of the fear or the shock of the distraction, not see that under stress we are changing the narrative, changing the language, exposing ourselves to an inner dialogue that has changed for the worse, and that we're not seeing how this is affecting us. So this little experiment actually reveals quite a lot of the challenges that we have in dealing with the unhealthy inner dialogue. It's of course totally normal to see women holding pigs on the streets of London. So the narrative is the story or stories that we tell ourselves about our identity, about the world around us. The narrative is crucial because when all the noise comes together, certain themes, certain words, certain ideas can predominate. And what we want to know is, are those helpful, supportive, and healthy ideas and words, or are they words such as fear and danger, and words that work against us developing a calm and open perspective on the world. It's important to remind ourselves that we can change the narrative. The narrative does grow and evolve, and we can actively participate in that. And we can avoid what it was so aptly described again by Jaddu Krishnamurti, a mind that is full of conclusions is a dead mind. It's not a living mind. A living mind is a free mind, learning and never concluding. And that brings us nicely on to our third aspect of our talk, and that is, how are we going to cultivate a healthier dialogue? It's important to recognize that that self-acceptance and self-actualization are at the heart of making small incremental changes. This was nicely encapsulated by a quote from St. Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century. If you would attain to what you are not yet, you must always be displeased by what you are. In other words, we must be prepared to face our weaknesses. We must be prepared to see what is in this inner dialogue so that we can change it. We must not defend against it, and we must not become condemning and judging of ourselves in a way that is unhelpful. And again, also with self-actualization. So St. Augustine tells us, you aspire to do great things, begin with little ones. This is such a crucial concept, and one that I seem to never tire of repeating. I'm fond of talking about the little things, the little changes, the little traumas. I am often faced with patients who will come into the office and they will expect some great epiphany. They will think that in an hour's conversation, that at some point the clouds will part, the heavens will open, the trumpets will blare, and all will become clear. And of course, I'm very quick to disappoint them on that one. But the truth of it is that it is the little things that will build incremental change. And having the discipline and having the ability to make those sustainable will lead us to develop healthier habits. So let's think more concretely about what some of these healthier activities and habits could be. Well, the first thing to consider is making internal dialogue external dialogue. We said earlier that we live in a world where there is incessant chatter, and there is a sort of plethora of what we might call non-communication, tweeting, Snapchatting, language reduced to its most basic, and language which doesn't invite any kind of conversation, but just endless proclamations. And if we can cultivate the art of conversation, we can get back to some of the healthier ways in which we use language to communicate both externally and internally. We can cultivate our ability to observe rather than judge. We can cultivate the all-important art of listening. We can learn to communicate non-violently. That is, we can express ourselves through observation, sharing our own feelings, and making requests and stating needs that are universally understood amongst us, rather than broadcasting demands and making judgments. The Roman orator Cicero said, silence is one of the great arts of conversation. And so it is that we desperately need to, in this time, cultivate the ability to listen and go beyond listening just to what the words of the other person are, but what is behind the words, to be able to truly empathize and understand, to listen to the point where the understanding becomes fuller and more profound. And we can't do that if we're having conversations in our head that we could be having with significant people in our lives. Another way of getting this conversation out of our heads is to put it down on paper. Journaling has been a favorite intervention of therapists for a long time. And it's because when we see things down on the paper, we can be a little bit more objective. We can be a little bit more reasonable in our understanding of what the words and the dialogue are. There's many ways we can do this. You can use one of the ways in which the inner dialogue is studied is something called descriptive experience sampling. And all that is giving people a beeper, and every time the beeper goes off, they're asked to record what is going on in their head. And then that may be further analysed in conversation with a researcher or an experimenter. But we can do that for ourselves. You could set an alarm, take an afternoon where you have got some time and set an alarm to go off every 30 minutes or every 60 minutes and just journal what it is you're thinking about at the time that the alarm goes off, what conversation you're having with yourself or what you're doing, and get an appreciation of, what is actually in your inner world. Is it polluting? Is it healthy? Is it helping you? We said earlier that one of the tendencies of the human mind is to focus on the negative and what is missing. And so we can focus on writing in gratitude rather than complaining and criticizing. At the end of the day, we can make observations of the good things that happened in our day to try to counteract some of this negative inner dialogue. If you are a ruminator, one little trick that I often use with patients is to get them to write a detailed account of what it is that they're worried about, that they're having difficulty in letting go of, and to write that detailed account on paper so that they have it, they won't get forgotten, they don't have to perpetually revisit it 5 times a day, and seal it in an envelope and label the envelope, and then give themselves the luxury of going back to it maybe in a week or in a month, safe in the knowledge that it's all been recorded and documented, that the complaint has been made. That way you can stop just perpetually examining it in your head. In a similar way, you could write letters that you do not send, letters to yourself, letters to other people, getting those ruminations, getting that internal conversation down on paper. Or if you really want to go for it, you can develop your own kind of biopic. You can start to write the story of your life. You can start to write the story of your future. You can begin to see how putting words down on paper, the power of what these words will do in forming your reality. Central to all of those activities is, of course, the concept of letting go. And, of course, letting go isn't just an idea, it's a very practical intervention that we can do with our inner dialogue. I'm fond of dropping things in front of patients to illustrate that letting go is just that, letting go. It takes a lot of energy to hold on. You become a lot lighter if you can just let go. So there are many times where the scramble of inner conversation is such that we can just tell ourselves, okay, time to let go. And we can practice that. But again, it's best to practice it with the small things. Not the big, complex issues in your life, but the small things that you carry around, that you constantly go back to and serves no purpose. Practice letting go of those things first. We already mentioned the importance of the conversation and how it relates to our conversation with ourself and the ego. So we can practice that. We can practice developing a flexible ego, learning to accept our limitations and weaknesses and work on them, but work on them with kindness. Also, to recognize our strengths and talents and use them with humility and compassion. The work of the Anthropedia Foundation developed many very powerful and useful meditations, one of which is Silence of the Mind. Silence of the Mind is particularly apt in dealing with our inner dialogue because it recognizes the importance, first of all, of calming and relaxing the mind, of becoming aware of this constant chatter, what we might call mindfulness, but also, and very crucially, going beyond it. So learning to let go of the constant chatter through mindfulness so that we can go beyond the constant chatter and experience the very real benefits of deeper contemplation, which start to remove a lot of the incentive or the attraction that traps us in the internal chatter. For those of you who haven't experienced Silence of the Mind meditation, I'd encourage you to attend one of the meditation classes that are available virtually from Palm, where you can learn this very simple but effective meditation. And that, of course, reminds us that there are also physical ways in which we can calm the body, the brain, and therefore the internal chatter, whether it's through techniques like neurofeedback, whether it's through the flotation tank, the thermal beds, activities that are available at Palm, and also activities that are available at the Wellness Agora. We can, through experiencing true physiological relaxation and calming our body, we can become better equipped to both be aware of our inner noise and also let go of it. And finally, we should reflect on the power of the words themselves. We've said that the external words and the internal words can become coded within our brains and within our bodies. And so rather than just thoughtlessly allow ourselves to be constantly exposed to damaging and violent words, why not spend a little time creating a lexicon of positive and uplifting words that you reflect on? This can be done through looking through synonyms and changing your vocabulary and cultivating a different vocabulary. Also collecting quotations that are meaningful to you, displaying inspirational quotes around your house to remind you to internalize meaningful and powerful words that help you rather than hinder you. And likewise, we can also work to drop some of the violent words from our inner and, of course, our outer dialogue. So we can see that there's a whole range of things that are very practical, very accessible things we can do to begin little by little. And again, that is the key message here is choose one thing, try that, don't be too ambitious, and just little by little create sustainable habits that can change the way you talk to yourself, and you can create a pure internal world for yourself. And let's remind ourselves again of what we said earlier, that it's not just about developing a healthier inner dialogue for ourselves. It's because that inner dialogue is part of the greater ecosystem. To quote Gandhi, we but mirror the world. All the tendencies present in the outer world are to be found in the world of our body. In other words, by working on our inner dialogue, we can be the change that we want to see in the world. Which reminds us that there is another inner voice, right? An inner voice that is not the second-hand speech that we have adopted from the outside world, or the ceaseless, meaningless chatter that we are exposed to constantly, or the pointless ruminations that we indulge in an almost superstitious way as we worry and ruminate on our lives and our futures. But when all of that is quiet, we can begin to experience something of a higher inner voice. And in those states of contemplation and connection with something beyond us, we see it's very different parts of our brains that will be activated. But even before technology that allows us to see the difference between these contemplative states and these states of inner rumination, great thinkers throughout human culture have reflected on the importance of calmness to allow us to access this powerful inner voice that connects us to so much universal wisdom outside of us. Plato said, wise men talk because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something. J. Krishnamurti said, if we know how to listen, that very listening is an action in which the miracle of understanding takes place. St. Augustine again said, the punishment of every disordered mind is its own disorder. Cicero, a happy life consists in tranquility of mind. Francisco Petrarch said, while life is in your body, you have the reign of all thoughts in your hand. And finally, Gandhi again, I shall lose my usefulness the moment I stifle the small voice within. So maybe we'll finish with a quote from Gandhi because it encompasses and captures very well what we've been talking about today. Keep your thoughts positive because your thoughts become your words. Keep your words positive because your words become your behavior. Keep your behavior positive because your behavior becomes your habits. Keep your habits positive because your habits become your values. Keep your values positive because your values become your destiny. So, although this was a rather rapid overview of what is actually, of course, a very complex part of our psychology, we can see that our inner dialogue provides us with a great opportunity. It's a very accessible way to begin to work on thoughts and emotions and to cultivate the kind of resilience and calmness that makes us much more able to deal with the external stresses and also able to put those stresses into some kind of perspective. Through working on our own inner world, we no longer become victims of the outer world, but rather we become participants in the creativity of our psychological as well as our material ecosystem. So I hope that that little overview was helpful, and I look forward to seeing you again on another webinar and hopefully in Palm Health. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.